Welcome everyone to King's Politics. I'm Miz, one of the co-chairs at King's Politics, and we are delighted to be joined by Professor Steven Pinker. He is a cognitive psychologist, a psycholinguist, and a popular science author. He is a Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University, specialising in developmental linguistics and visual cognition. He has written numerous books, from The Language Instinct to How the Mind Works, to Enlightenment now. His latest book is Rationality, what it is, why it seems scarce, and why it matters. I guess as a first question, I wanted to touch upon the invasion of Ukraine. You, of course, wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. And in an article about the issue, you noted that two contributors of peace did not apply to Russia: democracy and Enlightenment humanism. How significant were those two factors for the present situation?
Of them, the rejection of Enlightenment humanism is I think the dominant factor, because Putin has been very clear throughout his career that he prioritizes the grandeur, the preeminence, the glory, the greatness of civilizations, of Russian civilization, certainly above the value of human life, as we've tragically seen over the past week. I think that ideas are causal forces in historical events. There was certainly no trigger for the Ukraine invasion that one can identify in terms of security, resources. It was rather the idea that there are historical humiliations that have to be rectified, that there is a national destiny of Russia, which includes restoring the Russian Empire and incorporating Ukraine. That was the proximal cause of the war. The rest of the world has reacted, or most of the rest of the world has reacted in horror, simply because that's not a value that most people consider to be to trump the value of thousands of human lives. So that's one. I think that the absence of democracy is a contributing factor in that. It's not. I don't know enough about the governing elite in Russia. It's not clear how popular this idea would have been, but for Putin himself. And we know that Putin, by his ability to control media, to jail political opponents, has not opened himself up to feedback, criticism, let alone the levers of power. And so he's dragging his country into a war that they very well, almost certainly will regret. Now, it's not that that's impossible in democracies, as we've seen in the United States with the invasion of Iraq. But some of the unique features of this particularly deranged invasion came from I think the excess power and control over information of one autocrat.
I guess the other three contributors of peace that you mentioned, which do apply to Russia, are interstate trade, membership in a global organization, and the UN's outlawry of wars of aggression. Were these contributive factors significant for stalling Russian aggression, and if perhaps not outright preventing war?
Well, they were part of. I think everyone, except for people who I think probably disingenuously say they predicted it all along. I mean, most people have been, shocked that this actually happened. At least, if you'd asked people 6 months ago, would we see an outright, all-out military invasion? Most people would have said that seems very unlikely. And the reason they would have said that is because there is a norm and indeed a law against aggression. That is the waging of a war of conquest, other than in self-defense or with the approval of the United Nations Security Council. So, and the fact that the condemnation has been nearly universal with the vote in the UN General Assembly of only five voting against, 35 abstentions, but more than 100 condemnations. It shows that that the norm really is in place, and contrary to the situation of the world before the establishment of the UN, and particularly before the Kellogg-Briand Pact of the late 1920s, conquest was a perfectly legitimate way for countries to settle their differences, and the conquests would be recognized. A big change documented in an excellent book by Scott Shapiro and Una Hathaway called The Internationalists is that there was a momentous shift in the 20th century that war became illegal, contrary to centuries, maybe millennia of practice in which war was just, as Clausewitz said, the pursuit of diplomacy by other means. So that obviously it was not, did not prevent the war, but it was seen as a breach. And the analogy that Hathaway and Shapiro make is laws against murder don't reduce murders to zero. Murders still take place. But there's a big difference between a country in which a murder happens, but everyone acknowledges that it's illegal and that the perpetrators are brought to justice, and an anarchy in which there's no law against murder in the first place. So that's a situation that we have lived with since 1945. It has not, obviously, as with laws against rape, murder, assault, robbery, and so on, they're not always effective, but they probably are better than the alternative. And this is a case in which a scofflaw just gave his middle finger to that law. Trade in general, it tends to reduce the likelihood of war. There are data showing that countries that trade more are less likely to have a militarized dispute. I think there were reasons to think that made Russia's invasion less likely, but it obviously didn't prevent it. Russia is a trading state. It's plugged into the global economy. If it was guided by any kind of material self-interest, it obviously would not have undertaken the invasion because it's been an economic disaster which will get worse and worse. So any leader that prioritized the affluence of his country would just never have done what Putin did. He obviously chose to prioritize national glory and rectification of past injustices over material wealth. Then membership in international organizations, again, this is an inhibiting force, but it's obviously not a guarantee, and in this case, it also failed. Russia is a member of the UN. It wanted to join OECD. It's already been booted out of the G7, G8. It's being kicked out of the Eurovision Song Competition, out of many international organizations. So it's not as if that makes war impossible, but it does exact a price. And so far, Putin is willing to pay it. If his citizens aren't happy with that, that will be at least one mitigating force that will reduce his popularity. Now, of course, an autocrat doesn't have to be popular, but on the other hand, when elites turn against autocrats, there's at least some possibility of him being deposed, or of changing his mind and seeking some kind of face-saving exit.
I guess the key question now is whether this will escalate into a wider conflict involving multiple nations. The UK, for instance, is hesitant to introduce a no-fly zone due to this possible prospect. Are we in a different situation in comparison to, I guess, the two world wars?
Well, we are in a different situation, although there's no way of saying that we can't return to that situation. But one can imagine if a provocation, or not a provocation, but as an actual breach of international law would have taken place 100 years ago, it's quite possible there would have been an armed response from NATO or the US and the EU. That's very unlikely to happen, precisely because no one wants a world war. That doesn't make it impossible, but it makes it unlikely. And of course, the policy is right now of the United States is not to put boots on the ground or air power. For that reason, I suspect a no-fly zone is unlikely.
I guess in your op-ed about Ukraine, you argue that whether warfare is temporary or escalates into a larger cycle of violence is dependent on whether we promote the forces of enlightenment. I guess could you possibly expand on what exactly in terms of policies, in terms of values, one needs to do from here on?
Well, it's in you're not recognizing that is as an ultimate value. Like, what are our policies ultimately designed to maximize, to foster? There is a view that there is such a thing as spheres of influence, that there are natural domains that countries have a right to values like the glory, the grandeur of a country are causes worth dying for, worth fighting for. To the extent that that is devalued compared to the ultimate goal, that what we ought to strive for is for people to lead long, happy, prosperous, safe, and healthy lives, then we wouldn't have policies that would say it's okay to wage a war to restore your glory, that the price of thousands of lives would be worth paying only if it prevented an even greater number of lives from being ended. I think most of the world is heading in that direction, which is why the condemnation is so widespread. It's certainly not universal, and authoritarian and nationalist populists the world over don't subscribe to it. So it is a battle of ideas, of values. The European Union, to a large extent, is committed to it. I think more and more of the world. But there are also very powerful counter-Enlightenment, romantic nationalist, romantic militarist, authoritarian, populist ideologies that are opposed to it.
I want to touch upon your other book, Enlightenment Now, where you convey of course, the levels of progress brought by Enlightenment values, reason and science, amongst other things. Has the pandemic, with the need to halt the economy, with other implications, set back progress, or is there still a case for optimism?
Oh, it's unquestionably set back progress, but that's in the nature of progress, that it doesn't happen by itself, that it is a constant Sisyphean battle, pushback against forces in the human condition that will naturally grind us down unless we solve problems to mitigate them. The antagonistic processes of evolution, namely evolution is driven by reproductive success. That includes the reproductive success of viruses and microorganisms, means that we constantly are fighting a battle against other organisms, against disease organisms and spoilage organisms and pests. To the extent that we maximize our own health and happiness, it's often because we are ingenious enough to fight back against the little germs and bugs that want to eat us from the inside. There's no guarantee. In fact, we know that it will never happen, that evolution of pathogens will stop. We're very tempting targets to microorganisms, big chunks of meat there for the eating. And pathogens will always arise, and it's up to human ingenuity to fight back. And there are other processes that will always push back against human progress, one of them being human nature, particularly the strains of human nature that value the deference to authority, tribal solidarity, the glory and dominance of the group. That has to always push back against forces like other parts of human nature, like empathy and self-control and cognitive processes that allow us to take the long view and to solve problems. But all of those strains are part of human nature, and they will always be doing battle. Now, I think that the reason that this isn't just an oscillation, that history isn't cyclical, that there really is progress over the long run, is that knowledge accumulates. People learn from, and civilizations learn from mistakes. And so some things, once they're abolished, more or less stay abolished. We don't have human sacrifice anymore. We don't have legal slavery. The women's suffrage is pretty much a one-way street. And it is quite possible. I mean, it certainly seems less likely this week. And it may never happen, but it's at least possible that interstate war could be one of the barbaric human customs that goes the way of burning heretics or laughing at the insane or throwing virgins into volcanoes to appease angry gods. That was the direction the world was going. This is a big reversal. The question is whether it will be a kind of last gasp, whether it will be kind of like Napoleon's reintroduction of slavery in France after it had been abolished during the Revolution. A huge step back, but a temporary one, or even, as I note in the Boston Globe article that came out this morning that you alluded to, even when the biblical Israelites had abandoned human sacrifice, they kept backsliding. There were laws that thou shalt not sacrifice thy children to Molech at the altar on Tophet. So it didn't happen instantaneously. There's no real good outcome for what is happening in the last week, but the least bad outcome would be if the invasion ultimately fails. It won't fail militarily. There's no doubt that there'll be conquest. But if it ends in some kind of Afghanistan-like attrition and withdrawal, it will be one more lesson to the world that interstate war and conquest are really, really bad ideas.
I guess I want to move on to your latest book, which is Rationality. You must get this question quite a lot, but how does one define rationality?
I define it in the book as the use of knowledge to attain goals, or to attain a goal, where knowledge, borrowing the standard philosopher's definition, is justified true belief.
And of course, you cover in your book how important rationality is towards progress and improvements in collective society. How powerful can rationality be if it is truly fostered widely?
Oh, unlimited, in the sense that it's knowledge that allows us to change the world to our advantage. That's what resulted in the development of the mRNA vaccine against COVID in less than a year. But even before that, the dozens of vaccines that had already lengthened human lifespan, the invention of sanitation, of antibiotics, of blood transfusions, of synthetic fertilizer, of robust hybrid crops. Now, those are all in the material world of nutrition and protection against disease. But one could also make the argument that to the extent that we have enjoyed a respite from interstate war, that the long peace has largely held until this week. The long peace being the decline of interstate war between in Europe and between developed states in general. And more generally, there's been a decline in war in general, not as dramatic as the decline in war between countries, but even the death toll from civil wars has gone down bumpily. It's been a kind of a roller coaster, but a roller coaster with a downward trajectory. Those two didn't happen by themselves. Partly they happened by moralistic activism by John and Yoko and Peter, Paul and Mary and anti-war demonstrations, but also through mechanisms, products of human ingenuity that reduce the likelihood of war, such as interstate trade, such as intergovernmental organizations, such as the outlawry of war in the United Nations, and measures that were specifically introduced to lower the probability of war, and that don't always work, but have worked on average. Oh, and peacekeeping forces, another innovation.
Many do assume we live in a rational world, and I guess some may cite the proliferation of conspiracy theories during the pandemic. How do you view irrationality in the world? Do you think humans are naturally inclined to irrationality, or there's improvements we can make to stay away from irrational thoughts?
Well, humans, it is a mixed picture. I think humans are largely rational when it comes to dealing with their material circumstances. And that this includes some of the people who are prone to flamboyant irrationality. I mean, even the people who believe in QAnon and chemtrails and homeopathy are, you know, they hold jobs, they keep petrol in the car, they get the kids clothed and fed and off to school on time. So it's not as if they're delusional or living in a dream when it comes to their own concrete circumstances. When it comes to more kind of cosmic questions, what are the causes of human fortune and misfortune? What happens in the halls of power, in corporations and companies? What happened in deep history? Where did our species come from? There, people don't get feedback from the decisions, the opinions they have in, and the choices they make. It's kind of a form of self-expression. And many people, I think the natural human state is to hold beliefs in this mythological realm, this realm that doesn't impinge on your day-to-day life, really as expressions of your moral identity rather than as serious commitments as to the factual state of affairs, which for most of human history, no one could know anyway, until the advent of modern science and government record-keeping agencies and responsible journalism. No one really knew what happened in palaces and corporate boardrooms, or thousands of years ago, or other planets and galaxies. And so a story that makes your tribe look strong and moral and powerful was comforting, and it's the best you could do anyway. Now that I think a lot of the unease that we feel about this irrationality today is that we can do better. We have, since the Enlightenment, developed institutions like science and data sets and record keeping and serious history and serious social science. So we can answer questions like who caused a war and for what reason. There is an objectively correct answer, but human intuition, human cognition doesn't work that way. It's you hold opinions because they make your side look good. So someone who believes, for example, that Hillary Clinton ran a child sex ring out of the basement of a Washington pizzeria, what does it mean to say that they believe that? What it means is, well, I think Hillary is so depraved, it's the kind of thing that she could do, and how do we know that she didn't? Or even just, it's another way of saying, boo, Hillary. Now, those of us in universities might say, no, you can't do that. You can't just have a belief about a factual matter because it makes your side look good and makes the other side look bad. You can only believe something if it's true, or if you can show it's true, or if there's reason to believe that it's true. I don't think that's the way human cognition typically works. I mean, it should work that way. We should promote that style of belief, but it's not the natural way of believing. So that's a big part of it. I think it's intensified by the fact that those of us who do like to think that we base our beliefs on factual reality, none of us has the competence or the time to investigate every last issue by ourselves. We kind of trust the people in the white coats when they tell us that vaccines work, and we trust the historians and when they say that no, there isn't a worldwide Jewish conspiracy to dominate the world economy. But a lot of that depends on trust. Who do you trust? And if you if the signaling of these truth-seeking organizations is one that excludes large parts of the population. They're going to blow them off, and they will be happy to accept to get their truth from alternative institutions. So I think those are some of the constituents of the ever-present human irrationality. It's not clear that it's gotten worse. I suspect it hasn't, but it's always been with us, and it's always something that we've got to push back against. I mean, those of us who think that there really is such a thing as the truth and that we can approach it.
On topic of, I guess, pushing back on irrationality, do you think there's scope to, I guess, rethink education policy to foster rationality?
I do. I think that some of the tools of rationality should be second nature and prioritized in education, such as statistics and probability. I was worried when I remember when I was in high school and I took trigonometry, and I thought surely trigonometry doesn't take up a big chunk of the curriculum anymore, but apparently in many high schools it still does. And I have nothing against trigonometry. I love trigonometry, but there are only so many hours in the day, and if it's a choice between trigonometry and probability and statistics, it really should be probability and statistics. By the way, this is a point that's been made by over a century. H.G. Wells made it, I think, in the 19-teens, but we still have to make it today. So that's part of it, together with, I think, some of the norms of rational discourse, of the idea that we are in a collective attempt to determine the truth. None of us has it. We're all fallible. None of us is omniscient. We all are subject to biases like confirmation bias, like my side bias, together with statistical fallacies like the gambler's fallacy and base rate neglect and sunk cost fallacy. Avoiding these fallacies should be part of education, but also promoting norms both in school, but also in our op-ed pages and newspapers and parliamentary debates of kind of epistemic fair play, such as you don't attack straw man, but you try to attack a steel man. That is the strongest possible version of the argument you're opposing. You change your mind when the evidence changes. You try to collaborate with your adversary on an empirical test that would settle the matter a priori to both of your satisfactions. You take into account overall probability as opposed to being pushed by salient anecdotes or viral videos. All of these habits of rational discourse should be more widely promoted, not just in school, but in King's College and in the political societies and publication outlets and so on.
This will be the last question before I go to audience questions. And I guess outside of formalized education, do you have any advice for those who wish to embark upon, I guess, becoming more rational, acquaint themselves with the tools of rationality?
Well, I think mastering the tools, like if anyone does not know what Bayes' rule is, B-A-Y-E-S, that's just something that every educated person should know. It's not that complicated. I have a chapter on it in Rationality. I think everyone should understand what some of the main insights of game theory are, particularly in politics, how to tell correlation from causation, the elements of logic, of statistical decision theory, namely trading off false positives and false negatives. So I think there's that's the reason I wrote Rationality, is my attempt to give a primer on those tools in between two covers and in I think what I hope to be an accessible and entertaining format. But again, also the norms of rationality, epistemic humility, active open-mindedness, that is being prepared to change your mind when the evidence changes. There's a famous quote attributed to John Maynard Keynes. Was Keynes at Cambridge, man? I think he was, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was at King's.
Supposedly, he when he was criticized for flip-flopping, for changing his mind, he said, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" Now, it turns out he didn't say it, but it was a very good thing. for everyone to hold, whether or not Keynes was the first to have said it.
Now to audience questions. So I've had a few from the Google sign up form, and you can just enter them on the chat function on here. The first question, which has been given to me on private chat, is given Professor. Someone asks, given Professor Pinker's entirely natural enthusiasm for Enlightenment values and the unflagging pursuit of truth, what does he have to say about the very possibility of so-called information hazards, knowledge that would be harmful or dangerous if we came to know it? How does one accommodate this possibility in one's embrace of Enlightenment values?
So I'm not sure if that's a reference, say, to knowledge like how to make a nuclear weapon, or which I agree we would be better off if we hadn't gone there. And then maybe other cases such as gain of function research on viruses. I think it can be rational to demarcate certain limits of knowledge. The thing about rationality is it can always step back and look at itself, or look at applications of itself. And we can say, are there cases in which we shouldn't go there? That's going to be the topic of actually my next book. And that can apply to certain domains of knowledge. Are there certain topics in social science where we certainly never want to say something that's false, but where we could, postpone indefinitely getting to the bottom of some issue if it's not fundamental to science, but it could be socially harmful. There are cases in which, in diplomacy, in everyday life, in which we tell, white lies, strategic hypocrisy, plausible deniability. Our social life depends on that. We don't just blurt out everything we think about the person that we're talking to. And there could be cases maybe in more formal realms, such as politics and science, where we take a leaf out of the page of everyday life and decide not to pursue blatant truth down to the last detail. There are also cases of negotiation where there can be calculated abrogations of rationality, which of course we are unfortunately seeing in the case of the possibility that Putin is playing a madman strategy, that is acting so recklessly that his adversaries don't want to mess with him, are ready to assume the worst. And that can be a limited advantage in bargaining, as the work of Thomas Schelling laid plain 60 years ago. It can be particularly dangerous when both sides play it. Ultimately, I think it doesn't work to the advantage of the madman, but it can be a short-term tactic.
Another question asks, how do you transition your research interests from psycholinguistics, morphological development, to rationality and politics?
Yes, how did I get into this? I used to spend all my waking hours worrying about irregular verbs. It's one thing led to another. The study of language, of course, has been always tied to the questions about human nature, particularly in the work of my former MIT colleague, Noam Chomsky, who was both the most influential living linguist, probably the most influential linguist in history, but also has promoted a view of human nature that is more innatist than the prevailing empiricist or environmentalist or learning philosophy of most social science and philosophy and linguistics when he came on the scene. So the topics are connected. In particular, Chomsky proposed that children learn language with the help of an inborn language faculty. He called it a language acquisition device. I called it the language instinct. It led to the question, if language is an instinct, what are the other instincts? And so I wrote a book called How the Mind Works, following the language instinct, in which I talked about human emotions and ways of learning and motives, like sexuality, like dominance, like disgust, like anger, like sympathy. That led to the question of, and some of the backlash that that book aroused, of why is human nature not just a topic in psychology and biology, but has such moral and political and emotional baggage. It's political philosophers have long said that theories of politics are based on conflicting visions of human nature, particularly right-wing and left-wing political ideologies. In issues like crime and racism and sexuality and the arts and child rearing and politics, they're intimately folded up with beliefs about human nature, what makes us tick, what are we born with, what do we learn, how malleable are we. So I wrote a book called The Blank Slate that explored that set of issues. That, as I said, one thing leads to another. And one of the strongest kind of sources of resistance against the very idea of human nature, the reason that people really like to believe in a blank slate, a belief that I think is false, but I think that it is often appealing, is it makes it seem like there's infinite scope for improving human condition, for progress. If we don't have nuisances like human greed and xenophobia and fallacious reasoning, well, nothing can stop us from making a better and better society, maybe even a utopia. On the contrary, if we are stuck with human nature, maybe that means that we're stuck with war and inequality and oppression forever. You can't change human nature. So I pushed back against that fatalistic interpretation of human nature. First of all, by saying that human nature is complex, it's got many parts. I think we really do have some rather ugly tendencies, but we also have empathy, we also have self-control, we also have cognitive problem solving. And it isn't just a theoretical question that human nature is complex, but empirically, a lot of things did get better. We really did abolish slavery. The Soviet Union fell. We'll see if it'll be revived. Capital punishment used to apply to 400 crimes, and now it's been abolished in country after country after country. We no longer have human sacrifice. So things can get better. That's just been a historical, empirical fact. The question is, how extensive and how did it happen? That led to The Better Angels of Our Nature, my book on the historical decline of violence. One example of which, of course, has been threatened, kind of at least temporarily overturned this week, namely the long peace, the decline of war between nation states. And after I wrote Better Angels of Our Nature, plotting 100 graphs showing that violence has declined, the next question was, well, what else has gotten better? And so Enlightenment Now had another 75 graphs on improvements in lifespan, affluence, reduction of famine, reduction of working hours, reduction of accidents, showing that progress seems to be a kind of a general phenomenon, and seeking, and again, since it doesn't happen by itself, there's no law of nature that makes progress happen, quite the contrary. What did make it happen? And I most generically pointed to what I loosely called Enlightenment values of reason, science, and humanism. Humanism being the prioritization of human life as the ultimate value with which we began this discussion today.
Another question which was sent privately to me reads, I follow Professor Pinker on Twitter and remember fondly something he tweeted a while back. And he says he imagined it was partly tongue-in-cheek. And this was in regards to his new book, Rationality. He said that one cannot really criticize rationality because one deploys arguments to do so, and so would be presupposing the tools being criticized. Is this a problem? Couldn't the criticism still be valid? And does Dr. Pinker think there are potentially non-rational critiques of rationality, maybe something like a poem or just a refusal to engage with arguments?
Well, I actually didn't mean it tongue-in-cheek. This is an argument that I adapted from Thomas Nagel and other philosophers. And there is something very special about rationality. and that is you you can't make an argument for, or for that matter, against rationality, because as soon as you make an argument, you are committed to rationality. That is, you're not threatening someone to mouth some words or bribing them. You are trying to persuade them. If you're trying to persuade them, that means you're committed to grounds for persuasion of a consistency with other beliefs that people hold, or logical consistency or conformity to empirical reality. As I put it, in any debate about against rationality, you show up, you lose. So it's, Nagel calls it a transcendental argument. He also calls it a Cartesian argument related to Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. It's an unusual state of affairs, but as it must be, if we're talking about the nature of argument, persuasion, belief in the first place. So yeah, I think that it's a game that you can't get out of. It's the water that we swim in.
Another question reads, how do you relate music, in your words, auditory cheesecake, to rationality and politics?
Oh, well, it would be a stretch. Probably the only connection, the common thread, and this is I took up the question in How the Mind Works. What is the adaptive value of music? And why did it evolve? And music does seem to be universal. I have a much more recent paper with Samuel Mayer and a number of other co-authors of a cross-cultural survey. And when before us, people said music is universal, but no one actually looked. No one actually, they just kind of said it. We actually did look. We went to the ethnographic archives and found that indeed every society has music. Every society sings, every society dances, every society puts music to a variety of uses, such as lullabies and love songs, and healing songs and war songs. So if it is universal, why did it evolve? How did it make our ancestors have more babies? And I suggested maybe it didn't. Maybe it did not have an adaptive value. Maybe it was a byproduct of other adaptations, like the auditory system, the emotional calls, language itself, which clearly I argue does have an adaptive function, namely sharing ideas and ensuring cooperation. This is maybe the most controversial thing I've ever written. People are I find academics and intellectuals are in a very strange position when it comes to music. The one diametric opposite to mine. A lot of people have a utter phobia of Darwinian explanations of human psychology, except for music. Everyone wants music to be an adaptation. I think all of the arguments for how it increases biological fitness are bogus. They don't make any sense. And so I suspect that music, in fact, is a byproduct of other faculties, particularly language. How does that relate to politics and history? Only reminding us that not everything that humans want and do is necessarily a Darwinian adaptation. Also, even if it is, an adaptation in the technical biologist sense just means something that allowed our ancestors to have more surviving babies. It doesn't mean adaptive in the sense of healthful, desirable, salubrious, good, a common confusion.
I guess another question reads, how do you think human language emerged and evolved?
Yeah, I would love to know. I would love even to have some kind of good evidence. I don't think we do. There is a theory that manual gestures were an intermediate stage, which I think is not implausible, just because we still have manual gestures. It is still part of our language. The sign languages of the deaf are completely expressive, so we know that it's a viable communication medium. Chimpanzees, who are our closest cousins, have manual gestures. That still leaves open the question of how we made the transition to vocal communication. And the sad state of affairs is that we really don't know. I wish we did.
I think this is a follow-up question on on music. Since music has no adaptive function, why does music still exist but not go extinct?
Oh, because it gives us pleasure. Lots of things exist that, in terms of the thing to remember about evolution is that it is a long-term process that shapes the human brain, but evolution does not actually kind of pull the puppet strings of behavior moment by moment. It's the brain that does it. Once the brain is in place, we do all kinds of crazy things that go against the process of evolution, like in my case, not having children. As far as natural selection goes, that's crazy, but as far as my own choices, that's the way I live my life. We do all kinds of things that give us pleasure. We have non-procreative sex. We take drugs. And we press our pleasure buttons in other ways, like making pretty pictures and enjoyable sounds. And so given that we have a brain that can take pleasure in certain kinds of auditory stimulation, we spend a lot of time kind of pressing that pleasure button. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Another question on the sign-up form for this event reads, do you anticipate biological predispositions about the brain plasticity with age has shifted? Am I at 25 at the peak of my brain development, or can I go to learn new technical skills and languages with a similar level rate of absorption and information crystallization?
Well, it depends on the kind of knowledge and skill. I have another paper that came out just in Science a couple of years ago with Joshua Hartshorn and Joshua Tenenbaum, showing that there is a sensitive period for learning grammatical patterns of a language that, although that only begins to close around age 17, later than most people, including ourselves, had anticipated, but that's what our data suggest. So yeah, learning a second language, if you start later in life, you probably won't be as proficient as if you started early, but you can still be pretty good. A lot depends on how many years you apply mastering it. And other aspects of language, and for that matter, knowledge, don't show that sensitive period. The acquisition of vocabulary, for example, doesn't have that sensitive period. Every time you are introduced to a new person, you remember their name, or you learn a new place name, a new street name, a new city name, you're learning new vocabulary items, and that that does start to decline as memory and brain function start to decline later in life. But compensating for the the slowdown in raw brain power, and it really sad to say it really does slow down. I can testify to that. You also build cumulatively knowledge and skills, and a skill once highly learned can become an automatic unit, can then become a module or a constituent in a more complex skill recursively. So, and that develops throughout the lifespan. That's why we don't, at least admittedly, I have a selfish interest in that, but while we don't put 60-year-olds and 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds out to pasture, we are cognitively slower. There's just it's sad but undeniable. But on the other hand, we know more. We've acquired more skills. So there is a mixture throughout life. The mixture changes, but there are trade-offs among different cognitive skills.
Another question reads, what's the best thing about being a cognitive psychologist?
Oh, being able to earn a living from asking the question, what makes us tick? I mean, what could be more interesting than the human mind? And so I do consider myself privileged that I have a position where I can get a paycheck for talking about it, teaching it, investigating it, writing about it. Everyone's interested in how the mind works.
Two questions, I guess, are about the remarks about music and dance.
I told you that music. Everyone's interested in music. Forget genocide and sexuality and politics and war. It's music is what everyone's interested in.
So the two questions essentially ask, could music and dance not be adaptive methods of improving group cohesion? And another question asks, since music gives us pleasure, do you still think music's not adaptive?
Well, the problem with the group cohesion theory, there are a number of problems with that. One of them is that contrary to an amazingly tenacious misunderstanding, what natural selection optimizes is not group coherence. This was something that Richard Dawkins had to argue against in The Selfish Gene, literally 45 years ago, 46 years ago. But it's still something that intuitively people can't get out of, that what natural selection optimizes is the number of copies of genes in successive generations. Now, sometimes that one of the ways in which genes replicate themselves is being part of cohesive groups, but cohesive groups can also exploit their members, and our own psychology does not make us just seamlessly meld into a group with a homogeneous interest. Individuals can be cannon fodder for a group. Most human groups throughout history have been polygynous. That means that some men get many wives and many men get no wives. That doesn't work out so well for the celibate men. So we do not have adaptations that simply make us make a group bond. There are some, but they always are calibrated against individual and ultimately genetic self-interest. But also, music is not just, it begs the question, it's almost circular, of why should music bond the group? Why would it be advantageous to the extent that you do merge your interests with other people's? Why would making harmonic and rhythmic noises be a means to that end? It's kind of, well, you think intuitively, oh, we all like to sing and dance together. Okay, why do we like to sing and dance together? That's you're back where you started. Finally, music is not exclusively or even predominantly a group activity. There are earbuds and AirPods and headphones and stereos that people have in their living rooms. People enjoy music perfectly well solitarily. They like it in a group. We do go to concerts. We do like to sing together. But music shows no signs of primarily being a group activity. So those are some of the reasons. So you're right that it's probably the most common, tied perhaps with the Mick Jagger theory that we sing in order to attract mates. The problem being that most of us aren't Mick Jagger, even those of us who enjoy music. In terms of if it gives us pleasure, then can it still be adaptive? Well, adaptive has two meanings. We have a common sense, everyday meaning of adaptive, meaning promoting values that we hold, healthful, worth promoting. But then there's the technical meaning within biology, the Darwinian sense, in which an adaptation is something that increased the reproductive rate of one's ancestors. So music is certainly adaptive. It's great that people get together, that we have musical ambassadors that bring people of different backgrounds together, communal pleasure. That's a great thing. So it's adaptive kind of sociologically and aesthetically. But just let's not confuse that with adaptation in the original biologist sense, not original, I shouldn't say, in the biologist sense of increasing number of surviving offspring.
I think this will be the last question before we wrap up. So this reads, in Rationality, you emphasize the necessity of man to be rational in order to be good. But surely there's no rational basis to what is good, i.e. there's no rational argument why happy is better than sad or healthy better than sick. Therefore, aren't ethics more emotional than rational?
Well, there is an emotional component to the extent that that is true. That is, to the extent that it is just my emotion that I'd rather be alive than dead, healthy than sick, comfortable than afraid and hungry. That part of it is emotional. This is the argument, the famous argument from David Hume. But given that that's not that negotiable, because if you didn't prefer to be alive than dead, you would be dead. You wouldn't be here. It's really hard to stay alive, and other forms of happiness and comfort are means to the end of staying alive. It's not a coincidence that people would rather not be hungry. If they were content with being hungry indefinitely, they'd be dead, and they wouldn't be here to have the argument. So yes, there is that irreducibly motivational, emotional component to rationality. The first question was, how do you define rationality? I said it's the use of knowledge to attain a goal. Well, the goal itself is exogenous to the process of attaining it. And if the goal is being alive and happy and healthy, indeed that isn't, that is prior to the use of rationality to attain it. But it's not that negotiable for the reasons that I said. Namely, it's a prerequisite to being there to have the argument in the first place.
I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you all for coming, and once again, a huge thank you to Steven Pinker for giving us so much time and answering so many questions. Thank you.
And thank you, Ms. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for your attention and your questions.